by Jennifer Bryson, who is watching today from Nebraska. Jennifer, if there's a question we need, we might be texting you midway. So who knows? I'm Angelica Tom. I'm the Senior Director of Operations here at the CIC, and it's great to have you here. After Dr. Bieler's talk, we will have a little coffee social, and it's a chance for you to ask questions one-on-one. I also just want to recommend taking a look at our upcoming event schedule, especially with Lent starting. We have a number of programs for Stations of the Cross, as well as a Lenten retreat, and many programs coming up, including an episode of Godsplaining that will be recorded here on St. Joseph's Day. But now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Bieler. He is from Switzerland and Germany, and he is an assistant professor of patrology and systemic theology at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for the Studies on Marriage and Family at the Catholic University of America. That's quite a mouthful to say, so I need to catch a breath. Dr. Bieler received his doctoral degree in theology at the University of Zurich in 2017, with a dissertation in patristics on the coherence of Maximus the Confessor's thought. He taught in the theology faculty at the University of Zurich and assisted the chair of patristics with teaching and research. He has collaborated in the production of a new critical edition of Theodoret of Cyrus's Compendium Hereticarum Fabularum. My Latin is terrible, so I make all apologies. He also works on the scholastic period, especially Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure, and published articles on Aquinas, Maximus Confessor, and Origen. In his work, he is striving to combine the usage of historical critical methods with faithfulness to the Church's living tradition. He is currently engaged in research concerning sacramentality in the Church Fathers, especially Origen, and he is a member of the North American Patristics Society and a great appreciator of the DMV, the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area that he has moved to. So please allow me to step away, and Dr. Jonathan Bieler.
Thank you very much, Angelica. It's a great pleasure for me to be here at the CIC for the first time. What a beautiful place, and thank you for having me and introducing me so kindly. And thank you all for being here in person and on the internet. I came a bit to this book like, the child came to the virgin, as it were. Jennifer Bryson asked me to help her translating from the German, since this is my native language, and the book was written in German. So she also kindly asked me to write an introduction, even though, as you just heard, my field is patristics or patrology. But I was able to dive into her thought a little bit and come up with something. So today I want to essentially give you a kind of framework to situate this book and present its core argument. I'm not simply reading my introduction because that would kind of be spoiling the fun for you. So I want to, not quite summarize the book, but give you a sense of the book, and so you know what to expect. According to the Jesuit priest Father Joe Fessio, the founder of Ignatius Press in San Francisco, Ida Görres is one of the forgotten theologians of the 20th century that need to be rediscovered today as an important voice in theology. Her book, What Binds Marriage Forever, on the Indissolubility of Marriage, translated by Jennifer Bryson with the help of yours truly, is one sign that such a rediscovery has already begun and is underway. In Germany, it is Professor Hanna-Barbara Gerl-Falkowitz and others who have for some time proposed Ida Görres as a fresh and important voice in theology that helps the contemporary church. And indeed, even though this book, presently under discussion, was published in 1971 and forgotten for a long time, it speaks with such a freshness and acumen about the current problems of modern people with the Church's teaching on the indissolubility of marriage that it is well worth introducing it to the American and to a wider English-speaking public. Granted that such most recent questions as same-sex marriage are well beyond the purview of the book, Görres still helps us see that the root issue in the discussions immediately following the sexual revolution, that root issue is the indissolubility, and still is the indissolubility of marriage. If the indissolubility of marriage falls like a row of dominoes, the floodgates are open to reduce marriage to any sort of contract. At her time, there were some influential intellectual voices that Ida Görres, a lay theologian, had to contend with. One of them was Robert Hotz. He was a Jesuit, doctor of theology, Jesuit priest, and also the editor of the Swiss Jesuit journal Orientierung, Orientation, at the time. He is one of the main opponents she's facing in the book. She quotes from one of his articles that he published a year earlier. She, with the self-confidence of someone who lives a truly ecclesial life, imbued with a deep theological formation, an acute and well-formed sensus fidei, a sense of the faith, coupled with what she calls a kind of merciless view of the world that reminds one at times of a St. John Chrysostom. Ida Görres, she approaches the mystery of sacramental marriage and faced the contemporary debates surrounding it at her time. She says of herself that this merciless view of the world she got from her Japanese mother. I don't know if that's a correct thing to say nowadays, but that's what she says. I forgo to say much about her life here because besides a little bit what follows, but as Jennifer Bryson, the translator, she is much more competent than me on that score of the life of Ida Görres. Just a couple of brief notes. Ida Görres was born in 1901 to a lineage of nobility, Austrian nobility, the von Coudenhove-Kalergi family, who had their residence in the Bohemian forest. Her mother was Japanese, as I mentioned, whom her father met on a diplomatic mission to Japan. Her father died early, and her mother was a rather distant person. Ida grew up in convent schools, was even a novice for a brief period, and then encountered the Catholic youth movement, mostly in its quick-born branch at Burg Rothenfels, where Romano Guardini was a very important figure. So she was closely acquainted with him. And she played an important role in that movement, and people sort of expected her to, become a lay consecrated woman, but then eventually she married Karl Josef Görres in 1935. Their marriage remained childless, and Ida poured her energy out for the life of the church by studying, publishing prolifically on particular saints, for example, and being active in the life of the church in different roles. From 1950 on, she started suffering what can be called periodic cerebral circulatory disturbances. At least that's what I looked up online. That's what the German word translates into. I'm sure you could call it more technical, like a hemorrhage, like blood vessels popping in her brain, essentially. This made her, since 1950, hard for her to walk and work, but nonetheless she continued writing and publishing at an incredible pace. 1971, the year What Binds Marriage Forever was finished, shortly before her death, and then published posthumously. She died of a brain hemorrhage a day after presenting and discussing at the so-called Würzburg Synod on the holiness of the Sabbath day. So you can imagine that those discussions at the Synod might not have been the most calm and relaxing event. Besides Michael the Archangel, who was her favorite of all saints, her most beloved human saint before the fact was arguably Saint John Henry Newman, recently canonized and pronounced by Pope Leo, a doctor of the Church, and together with St. Thomas Aquinas, a co-patron of the Church's educational mission. Indeed, if you open up the book and open up the text, besides a quote on marriage as the highest mystery by the German poet Novalis, you can read there the epigraph, a long epigraph by Newman. Newman provides Görres with the epigraph for this present work. And I think this is pretty important, that she puts a long quote of him at the very beginning. And it is worth reading that, partly at least. Newman says, rationalism is a certain abuse of reason. That is, a use of it for purposes for which it never was intended and is unfitted. To rationalize in matters of revelation is to make our reason the standard and measure of the doctrines revealed. To reject them if they come in collision with our existing opinions or habits of thought, or are with difficulty harmonized with our existing stock of knowledge. And thus, a rationalistic spirit is the antagonist of faith. For faith is, in its very nature, the acceptance of what our reason cannot reach, simply and absolutely upon testimony. This is Newman. In the book, Görres makes clear that Catholic marriage indeed is such a matter of revelation. As such, it is not measured by the standard of our reason. Rather, it is a mystery. So that notion of mystery comes at the very beginning with Novalis' quote, that marriage is the highest mystery. And then she quotes Newman about rationalism. So this tension between reason and the mystery forms a bookends the book. Because at the very end of the book, she quotes Ephesians 5:32, where it says marriage is a great mystery. So mystery, that word, is framing what she's saying. Can you hear Margaret? Or can you hear me? Yes. Anybody else? Should I speak a little louder? Okay. As I just said, marriage is a mystery. And the notion of mystery appears, as I said, at the beginning and at the end of the book. What does she mean by saying marriage is a mystery? I think marriage is not mysterious, she says, in the sense of unintelligible, such that marriage simply cannot be understood and is therefore not really accessible to us. If you go back and look at the Greek sense of mystery, mysterion, that Paul uses, for example, what Paul means when he uses the word mysterion is first of all the mystery of Christ himself. In the famous passage of the letter to the Ephesians that is at the end of Görres' book, chapter 5:32, Paul uses again the word mystery to describe marriage as it points to the great mystery of the union between the church and Christ. To maybe paraphrase Gaudium et Spes 22 a little, one could say that for Görres, in the mystery of Christ and his church, the mystery of marriage takes on light. Thereby it doesn't cease being a mystery. It remains a mystery. Mystery in this biblical sense later took on a more specific and technical sense that emerges when mystery was translated into the Latin, as the Greek mysterion was translated into the Latin as sacramentum, sacrament. Mystery also, for Scripture, carries the connotation of being an event, an action of God in the world, a life received by the church and affirmed in her. This connection between mystery and sacrament points to what Görres and Newman have in mind, in my view, when they speak about marriage and its indissolubility as a mystery. This is a mystery that is revealed and handed over, as it were, to the church to be a mystery lived in faith. The union between Church and Christ is communicated to and lived by the sacramental union of the spouses in marriage. Marriage thus is a mystery of a union that can only be lived out and received in faith. In virtue of this faith, Catholics can state that marriage, in the Catholic sense, is a greater reality than what our rationalistic conceptions allow for. And thus, we must be open to God's action in marriage and not narrow it down to our limited conceptions of it. I think that's one of the key insights we can derive from Görres' book. To make this point about marriage as a mystery with John Henry Newman and illuminate it, sometimes harshly even, sometimes with a deep sense of tenderness for the reality of humans in their failures, and always with a relentless clarity in search of the truth, was arguably one of Ida Görres' main goals with this book. So to illuminate this mystery without destroying it. This is, as I said, indicated by Newman's quote that we just read, as she puts that as the epigraph at the beginning of her main text. To maybe look a little bit about at the wider historical context, we can put Görres' anti-rationalist perspective on marriage in the historical context of the discussions on marriage as either a contract or a sacrament. What is marriage? Is it either a contract or a sacrament? There was a long discussion, of course, since Henry VIII, including the French Revolution, on this theme that we cannot dive into here now. But you can generally say that after the Reformation, with the Reformation actually, a tendency arose to push for marriage to be seen as primarily a natural or civic contract established by an agreement based on reason. As such, a contract, it was rather separate from and extrinsic to the sacrament of marriage rooted in faith. If marriage were a purely natural contract, its conditions and forms would naturally belong under the jurisdiction of the state or temporal powers rather than the church. So it was a struggle, these discussions about marriage between the power of the state and, as it were, the power of the church. Who has jurisdiction over marriage? And you can definitely see that the tendency is to assert the state's authority ever more and more. Several popes, among them Leo XIII, in his encyclical Arcanum Divinae Sapientiae, have emphatically stated that marriage between baptized Catholics is first and foremost one of the 7 sacraments, and that the contract is the marriage, and as such a sign of Christ's union with the church, and therefore indissoluble. So you cannot separate a dissoluble contract based on reason from marriage as indissoluble. Leo says in this encyclical, quote, "In Christian marriage, the contract is inseparable from the sacrament, and that, for this reason, the contract cannot be true and legitimate without being a sacrament as well. For Christ our Lord added to marriage the dignity of a sacrament, but marriage is the contract itself whenever that contract is lawfully concluded." So far Leo XIII. As a purely civic or reason-based contract, the form of this marriage and the expectations of it would be entirely dependent on consent. The consent of the spouses, in turn, is based then, in this view, on purely human reason and its considerations. If anything occurs outside of these bounds determined by reasons, the terms of the contract would be voidable. The perspective of faith and of the sacrament, on the other hand, allows for marriage to be more than what reason determines it to be. Faith allows for an openness towards God's action within the marriage, as well as for allowing the spouses to be more than simply rationalist actors in a contract. So that was sort of the historical context in which we can situate Görres' book, this discussion about marriage, either a contract or an indissoluble bond. To go back to Görres, we can say that she resists this temptation to reduce marriage to a contract that is a dissoluble bond. Over against the rationalist conception, her book is a defense, as it were, an apologia, an apology of the indissolubility of marriage from the point of view of faith and of the human being. And the human being, of course, for her, includes reason, but the human being cannot be reduced simply to reason without faith. She takes the human being seriously not only as kind of reason incarnate, but also as a historical, relational, and religious being, to whom such an indissoluble union deeply corresponds. The rather unwieldy German subtitle that does not appear in the translation because it's very unwieldy, and but here I'm giving it to you. It can be translated as follows: unsystematic meditation or considerations of marriage's indissolubility considered anthropologically. German is a beautiful language. It can be as complicated as you want it to be, whereas English doesn't allow for that, which is probably a good thing. Because Ida Görres escapes the purely rationalist consideration of the human being and thus marriage, she's able to situate the phenomenon of marriage in a much wider context than her opponents allow for. It might seem strange of me to say that Görres opposes a rationalist conception of marriage in her book, considering that what she refutes, if you read the book, she refutes a kind of equating marriage with what she calls love marriage. Love marriage is a marriage that is simply based on erotic attraction. Such a love marriage seems anything but rationalist, as it's based on emotion and fickle passion rather than reason, so it seems. It seems to me, though, that this form of love marriage is still fundamentally based on the rationalist conception of the voidable contract, now simply and exclusively based on mutual attraction. As long as the spouses have mutual attraction, they consent to this contract. But as soon as attraction dies away, the contract becomes void. Ironically then, at least in my view, the rationalist perspective on marriage Görres is faced with has turned marriage into the rather sentimental contract of the mere love union. But it's still a contract. It's still conceived in the categories of the rational approach to marriage, rationalist approach to marriage. The rationalist and the sentimental then seem like two sides of the same coin. Görres makes a point of showing that basing marriage on this purely erotic love union masquerades as reasonable, merciful, and advocating for the truth of the human being, while in reality, love marriage strictly narrows the horizon of what is considered an acceptable basis for marriage. For Görres, to say that erotic love is the ultimate root of marriage and its in or dissolubility is not a solid enough foundation, of course, for what marriage is for the Christian. So in the perspective of love marriage, what is presented as a liberated and widened form of marriage, because it opens it up to divorcees to remarry, for Görres actually constitutes a narrowing of its basis and an exclusion of those spouses whose union, for whatever reason, falls outside of the scope of erotic love. In the opinion of Hotz and others, so this Jesuit priest that she was in a debate with in this book, in his opinion and that of others, with her teaching on the indissolubility of the mystery of marriage, the Church acts unreasonably against the interests and nature of human beings and their legitimate need for renewed love even after a failed marriage. If the Church fails to recognize that divorce should be possible even in the case of a valid marriage, and therefore if it does not permit remarriage while the spouse is still alive, the Church acts inhumanly for Hotz. She's being inhuman against the human being. So in Hotz's eyes then, Church teaching and the human being's true needs are diametrically opposed to each other from the beginning, as it were. In this perspective, the situation of human beings in the past is cast as their unjust and irrational submission to the Church's power. This kind of submission, in this view, alienates man from himself and from others. In this framework of opposition between Church and man, one of the extremes of the opposition must bow to the other and budge. The new proposal of a pure love marriage, dissoluble in case of need, simply reverses the roles. Now the Church must budge in the name of justice and mercy to man, so that man can live a more authentic life. But by accepting such a framework of opposition, Görres' interlocutor has already succumbed to the great temptation, as Görres says, to take the side of humans against God. She makes that point with reference to Søren Kierkegaard, the great Danish philosopher. In the background of this opposition between Church and man, the greater and more dramatic opposition between God and man looms large. Henri de Lubac, in his book, titled The Drama of Atheist Humanism, has brilliantly exposed how modernity, at least since Feuerbach, Marx and Nietzsche, takes for granted such a paradigm of opposition between God and man. Instead, Görres says, Christian marriage grows out of the context of the whole of faith, the Christian and Catholic image of God, Christ, the Church, and the human person. But as soon as we pit man and God against each other, we are forced to establish from below what it means to be human and usher in what de Lubac calls an atheistic humanism. A feature of this a-religious humanism is to define God in opposition to man and man in opposition to God. So what happens, Görres says, we pit justice, divine justice, against human mercy. We pit Christ's divine lordship against the historical Jesus. We pit the Church against the free democratic organization of peoples. And lastly, we pit the human person as religious and eschatological being against a mere immanent frame, as it were, people whose happiness needs to be managed by a state authority, secular authority. And from these oppositions, once we enter into that framework and accept it, unwittingly or not, dissoluble marriage naturally results, as it were, because in the end, we have to choose man. Or we choose God, and then man drops out of the picture. And the teaching of the Church on man is portrayed as inhuman, and then you can just accept that, right? Instead, Görres wants to show that the indissolubility of marriage is for the human being. So that's why that subtitle, Anthropological Considerations of the Indissolubility of Marriage. So she shows how marriage as indissoluble makes sense when you look at man as more than just incarnate reason, right? Indeed, Vatican II and Gaudium et Spes 22, for example, directly countered this oppositional narrative by elucidating that the teaching of the Church is for man, not against him. And Görres follows closely this trajectory. Even though when you read the book, sometimes she's somewhat critical of some of the expressions used, especially by Gaudium et Spes 48 for marriage. Gaudium et Spes, at least when only read in isolation, she has a keen awareness of people using passages from that document to argue for love marriage. And she's not happy about that. The language of radical self-gift at the heart of marriage that Gaudium et Spes talks about seems to her to be at times vulnerable to the interpretation of marriage that makes it simply dependent on the passionate and erotic love relationship of the spouses. However, one can make the point that self-gift must not be reduced to erotic passion, as Gaudium et Spes does not do either. She writes that in the view of the defenders of serial marriage, she calls it serial killer, serial marriage. If you engage in a series of marriages and you are for remarriage and the dissolubility of it. For the defenders of serial marriage, marriage is the love bond of the couple. Love is constitutive of marriage in a large, deep, and exhaustive sense. The full mutual gift of body and soul, total surrender, a total fusion of two people, no longer two but one. The bond arises from this love bears it. So you can see she doesn't quite like that language. She quotes Hotz, who says, "Love is a mingling of two personalities. The indissolubility of marriage is a consequence of marital love. Marriage is indissoluble insofar as it is constituted by love." So far Hotz. But Görres responds, "Love is fleeting. Who does not know this? So if love dies, there's no need for further fidelity. When love withers, the fidelity inherent only to it also withers away. Marriage then ceases to exist, and the non-existent can neither be broken nor divorced, neither dissolved nor annulled. People become as internally free as before. When a new love," and here she uses quotation marks, "when a new love takes hold of them, they are free to conclude the bond of love again." Further, she says then, marriage, again in quotation marks, becomes an indefinable phenomenon in the atmosphere between two people, something that one has or doesn't have, regarding the existence of which only those involved can decide. So it's important to differentiate the senses of love, right? What do we mean by love? Is it simply an erotic phenomenon, or is it much, much deeper than that? Is it more of an anthropological reality in the wider sense? This kind of erotic love, she says, is too weak of a basis for marriage. As such, sexual attraction or love can wither in its intensity and disappear over time, thus giving grounds for dissolving the marriage. Here then is the nub of the issue for Görres. She says, this core problem lies in the modern, in my view, unsustainably far exaggerated equating of marriage and love, an attempt to cut through an immensely complex knot with a Gordian sword stroke. And then she adds, the purpose of marriage was and still is in some societies, she mentions East Asia, Africa, the purpose of marriage was generation. That's a key term for her, generation, in its twofold and very precise sense. The generations, namely those who are to come, and through generation as an act. Because marriage is understood to be multi-generational and not single-generational. So generation has to do with marriage. Generation as the lineage of people who come before you and then follow after you, as it were, through history. And generation in the sense of creating, producing new life, giving life to the members of this generation. And that's a much more profound reality for her. Rather than purely individual, erotic, mutual love detached from generation, Görres identifies the basis of marriage as it has been throughout history in generation. This term has a very wide sense for her. It includes procreation, a handing on of life, building of a family over generations, etc. In this wider perspective on marriage, marriage takes on a new light that allows the reader to see marriage as a much more human, as it were, proposal, that at the same time points the human beyond himself to others, past and future generations, and to the divine source of life. So the life that's being handed on in generation has its origin in the divine. So there's, as it were, a vertical axis as well as a horizontal axis to generation. Whereas love, marriage has just the axis between two individuals, as it were. The focus on marriage as bound up with generation in the wider sense of the term allows Görres to show in her book that true self-gift, to use this language, has in marriage a sacramental form that transcends the historical present of the two persons involved in it. Within this form, the personal relationship between the spouses finds its larger context. And this aspect of marriage she calls individual marriage, or also person marriage. Marriage in the full sense allows the spouses to grow into their full stature in ways that exceed the rational expectations. Marriage generates, in the best case, not only children, but it also generates the spouses and makes them better and more fully human. So much so that Görres can say that it is not love that generates and disintegrates marriage, but rather marriage generates love. Like it generates life, it generates love. Quote, the constitutive element of marriage is what our moral theology called until yesterday the goods of marriage. Proles, fides, sacramentum, as Augustine listed them. Namely, children, proles, committed lifelong community, fides, fidelity, and inviolability of the sacred covenant, sacramentum. Love can find its place within fides and sacramentum. It is very much desired. Yet love is not its root, rather its fruit. And then she adds, exactly this seems almost immoral to many contemporaries. They are embarrassed that the church has supported this barbaric, as they see it, inhuman concept of marriage with her theology and practice for so long. Görres, however, makes the church's proposal as strong as possible with the help of a more comprehensive view of man as open to receive new life in faith and hope. Görres shows how marriage is essentially this open gate for new life to enter the world in many different senses. The objective form of marriage generates human beings in the full sense of the word. As the Catechism says now, quote, "The fundamental task of marriage and family is to be at the service of life." End quote. In this context, marriage as a mystery of life and the handing on of it by generation, the indissolubility of marriage means that the gift the spouses make of themselves to each other in marriage must last throughout their lives. This is because what they give to each other is truly given and truly received once it is given in the name of God and under His authority through the church. Like life. Life is given to you from the beginning. It's given. Otherwise, it wouldn't be life if it were not truly given once and for all. This life unites the spouses, and only death does them part. I think one of the strongest points in the book, even though it seems made in a slightly implicit way, is to show how love marriage is stifling life, leading to a kind of death, what has been called, as you know, a culture of death. Görres sees that pure love marriage negates the dimension of kinship within marriage. Kinship also has to do with generation. What does Görres mean by kinship and kinship marriage? This is another key component of what marriage is. She writes, "The crucial intermediate determination that lies between the species and the individual, kinship, gens, and lineage, Geschlecht in German, in the connected sequence of generations from a point of origin. The actual process in life of kinship is growth, maintenance, continuation over time. This requires three groups: the ancestors, the current bearers, and the descendants, for whom the heritage, tangible as well as spiritual, is guarded and extended. This process is a unity, the handing over, the transmission, and the tradition as an object and as a perpetual act. Since humans are mortal, the actual bridges that keep passing on the legacy beyond the boundary of death are marriages." She says further, "Marriage does not create a family, instead it continues one." Kinship marriage, then, it was always open to individual marriage, and in this to love marriage. And then she says, or exclaims rather, "And oh, how often this may have been successful within kinship marriage." So her point is, if you lose sight of this aspect of generation in marriage, you're essentially abstaining from handing over the life, right? And if you don't do that, what results is death. In this context of marriage being historically and anthropologically about the handing on of life, that such a handing on of life generates also love, the technological possibility of effectively unmooring fertility and fruitfulness from the sexual union of the spouses through contraception deeply inverts the identity of marriage and allows making erotic love primary. For Görres, then, separating what is called by Humane Vitae the procreative aspect of the marital reunion from the unitive aspect of marriage, that would have to do with the erotic aspect, and then say, well, the procreative and the unitive are both extrinsic to each other. We can bring them together or not as we wish. This separation and extrinsicity of both to each other makes us actually unable to understand the mystery of marriage, that marriage is about life. By doing so, we lose touch with other cultures and their understanding of what marriage is, and that it is intrinsically bound up with the handing on of life, generation, and kinship. We make the mistake that de Lubac warns against in his book, Catholicism. We end up identifying the Catholic Church with the particular Western culture in a particular historical situation. This has disastrous consequences. For example, the fact that the nature of the mission of the Church is radically changed, because the Church is prevented from evangelizing all of humanity, since her message does not resonate anymore with what Justin the Martyr would call the seeds of the Logos, found in other cultures. Such a concept of marriage is not Catholic, but modern and Western. I think I have another 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
You like.
Paradoxically, the proponents of the dissolubility of marriage argue in the name of a greater compatibility and credibility of their concept of marriage for an adaptation to the times. Görres says they argue the claim of the church to proclaim the good news and to be the representative of the merciful God proves itself to be most outrageously unbelievable as long as her law keeps these wounds open and insists on the concepts of guilt and restraint that society gave up long ago. If in any regard it is here that adaptation to the times is in order. So this is the argument of her opponents. The argument is that the church needs to give up her traditional teaching and adapt to the times so as to reach more human beings and be more believable. Arguably though, and Görres shows this, the opposite is achieved. Since rejecting one's tradition does not lend credibility, and neither does it lend credibility to the church when she addresses other cultures and different societies who have not given up what the church is asked to give up here, but they consider instead generation intrinsic to marriage. Rather than winning people for Christ, the church loses the Catholicity of her marriage, her message, and calls vast amounts of peoples inhuman and barbaric, essentially. By reducing then marriage to a rationalist conception of love, marriage that makes erotic love primary and lacks the sense of its mystery, Görres says, to use her words, that we exclude a whole rainbow of relationships. So erotic is not enough to bind marriage forever. That was 50 years ago, the word rainbow was still not as loaded as it is today. What binds forever for Görres? I guess to find out, you have to read the book. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for presenting this with the injured back, Dr. Bieler. Very much appreciate it. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. If we'll start with Jamie Hickman.
Thank you so much for presenting today, and to Dr. Bryson listening in, thank you for your contributions, obviously. So a question on background and influence on Ida Görres' life. Obviously she sees some of the bad ideas floating around on marriage, and she wants to defend it, but what are some of the positive influences that shape her understanding of the goodness of marriage? It's obviously hard to find a perfect couple out there, but maybe Mary and Joseph, of course, but in general, to see it in society, or does she have a great relationship with the Eucharist, where she's drawing from the relationship of the ultimate spouse? What are some of the key influences that can you speak to that would give her such a rich understanding of marriage?
I mean, at least in this book, it's. I guess I could say it's all that you've listed, in a way. The emphasis in this book, I think, is sort of the history of marriage. So she studied a lot of church history. I think that's one of her passions, history. And here she makes a big point that the human being is a historical being. So she looks at what marriage means in Roman times, or how do other cultures understand what marriage is. And I think she does so with a great sense of compassion, or also seriousness, that other cultures have seen something true about what marriage is when they talk about marriage in terms of the generation of people, generations and generation. And so I think from her studies on the history, she's much more sensitive to what is lost when you simply reduce marriage to love marriage, as is being done at that point in time. And I think she also sees that we lose the ability to talk to other cultures and be taken seriously, to speak a common language to them, so be able to evangelize, as I said in the end. I think at least in this book, that's pretty clear. So the anthropology is at the forefront here of her way of looking at marriage.
Excellent. One more question over here.
Hello, thank you. A very interesting talk, interesting subject. When she's talking about the sort of rational marriage, the love marriage that you're talking about, the idea, as I understand it, is that it's inhumane when mutual love has stopped to make people stay in a covenant or
Yes.
stay in a marriage when one would be happier if one married somebody else.
Yep.
Okay, so what if there's two people and one isn't in love and one is? Isn't that inhumane as well, to say, okay, I'm not in love, so I'm going to marry somebody else, and you're still in love, and I'm leaving the marriage? Like, is that addressed at all? I just find that an interesting thing to think about.
I mean, if you look at marriage as a contract, it has to have the consent of both parties, right? So, yeah, I think that's one of our main issues, is that if you just look at it in this way, there's no reason why the other spouse who's not in love anymore would not leave. And because it has to be a mutual contract. And then you can ask, well, what's just, what's unjust about it? That's a great question, because it widens our view of what justice is in that particular context. One having given the promise and the other rescinding the promise. Yeah, I mean, I think that's just another way of pointing out that in arguing for love marriage in the name of justice, a lot of injustices can happen, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Jonathan Bieler. He will be outside having a little coffee and tea time for a little social, so please join us in the bookstore where the books that are Edith Görres's books that have been translated by Jennifer Bryson are all on sale, including What Binds Marriage Forever. So thank you so much for being here, and we wish you nothing but the best Lent. Please come back, and let's continue the conversation.